Hi, and welcome back to Glassbox, my top 10 tech tips. Today we will look through my top 10 tips for beginner would-be Ruby and RSpec WebDriver writers. We will look through what I think are the top 10 tech tips to help someone new to Ruby and RSpec get up to speed quickly, in no particular order of importance. So let's begin. Number 1. Learn the basic syntax of writing a test using RSpec. So this is probably a given, but make sure you understand what kind of syntactical understanding you need in order to write a test using RSpec. So make sure you understand what describe is, what an it block is, what type of text you should write inside describe, how you should name your tests. So just make sure you have an understanding of the syntactical requirements and structure when writing an RSpec test. Number 2. Stop using should. Instead, start using expect. Shoulds and expect are basically validation checks used to check the value of something. They're used to check if something is true or false, and then they effectively either pass your test or fail your test. You should stop using should where possible, simply because it is a method that is almost being replaced by a brand new method, i.e. the except method. Going forward, Ruby will eventually be obsolete. So if you are still using should, upgrade to using the expect method. The expect method stands out as some form of validation, whereas the should method is more fine-grained into validation check code lines. So start using expect, because it is better to use a more robust version of validation checks as opposed to using an older version, in this case should. Number 3. Avoid using XPath and CSS selector where possible. Instead, use normal locators. As discussed in my CSS and XPath video, the problem with XPath and CSS is that they can be really brittle, and they can require a lot of maintenance in order to ensure that your test will run if something changes. You can be flexible, and XPath and CSS can be extremely powerful, but it is better to use your conventional locators instead, because the likelihood of these breaking is far less compared to the likelihood of XPath or CSS breaking. So where possible, use normal locators and try and avoid XPath and CSS. Number 4. Use before and after to better manage your test. So in our test, whenever we do something, we perform some kind of logic, try to manage things which don't belong in a test outside your test in before and after methods. So in this case, we're creating the driver in our before method, and we're quitting the driver in our after method, therefore taking away the responsibility of managing the driver from our test, allowing the test to concentrate only on the test. Doing this means if you have multiple different tests, you don't need to go into every single test and change the management of your driver. You just change it in one place, and the change is automatically propagated to all other tests, because they simply inherit the maintenance of the test without actually having to manage it themselves. Number 5. Write meaningful test names. So this is one of those things that you should kind of actively do without having to push too much thought into it. And it's that make sure whenever you name your tests, or whenever you name your describing blocks, just make sure that you give them some sensible names. Don't write names like test method 1 or test service 1 or test function 1. Nothing like that. Make sure you give your tests meaningful names that actually describes what the test is about. For instance, should check homepage title for tests inside test page headings, or should submit form with valid data and invalid data, tests inside this contact form submission test block. What this means is, if your test ever fail, all you need to do is just look at the title of your text to give you an understanding of the type of failure you have, instead of having to explore the test and find out what possibly could have gone wrong. Number 6. Use design patterns to better manage your tests. So in this particular test, I'm using the page object pattern to help me manage my test. I'm not going to go into what the page object pattern is. I've already done a video on it. Just refer to it. To gently highlight the advantage, by using page objects, I can reuse these methods in multiple different tests, saving me time. Also, for say this method here, which in the background is effectively doing a find element on an input field name, if the backbone HTML of any component changes, I only need to go and change it in one place. Other benefits of using page objects include better readability of your tests. So in this case, we know without having to look at what's happening from a driver's perspective. We know here that we're navigating to some route tab, we're then going to some contact thing, we're then filling in something, we're then submitting something. It just sets up the context and the description of the test a lot more easily than having to do some form of driver.findThis or driver.manage_that. So use page object pattern. It helps you to better manage your test and maintain the test over a long period of time. Number 7. Tests should contain logic only relevant to the test. So if you look at this test here, we're doing multiple things, including the logic of the test. So the purpose of this test is just to submit the form with valid data. But inside this test, we're creating instance of driver, we're doing an expect, and we're doing various other things which are relevant to the test. When you write tests, make sure that you write code inside your test that is only relevant to the test. That way, if your test fails, you have a better understanding of what that failure could have been, as opposed to, ooh, was it because something wasn't set up correctly, or was it because I wasn't able to navigate to some place correctly, which is outside of this test. So for instance here, we're only concerned with submitting valid data. So in other words, we're only concerned with this lines of code. We don't really care about the others. I suppose you can include this expect. So strictly speaking, we're actually interested only in this. All of this should have already happened somewhere else. Good candidates would be the before and after method. Number 8. Use collections, but only if you absolutely need to. So again, refer to my collections video if you want to have a bigger understanding of what collections are. Try to use collections if you absolutely have to. Try not to use collections as some kind of A plan. Collections can really help you to find various informations, and you can use them as some form of quick implementation of doing several things in one go, as opposed to doing several different actions individually. So for instance, if we were to navigate to some form page, if you just used a collection to grab all the necessary input fields, you can fill them all in one go using this approach where you just look through all the necessary fields, fill them each one at a time, and submit the form. The downside of using a collection is that you're not managing each field individually as you should. If, let's just say, you wanted to do some kind of test submission where you just want to fill in a single form, you may need to go back and change tests in multiple different places to cater for that action. So use collections only when it's very difficult to navigate to that particular element using XPath or CSS even. In fact, use collection as your last resort. Ideally, the approach I take is to use normal locators followed by XPath and CSS, and then followed by collections. Number 9. Use before and after methods of each and all versions to better manage your test setup. So we've already talked about this before and each, and setting up, or rather managing, the driver instance inside this before and each. But we have other versions. In particular, we've got two different versions. We've got a before all version, an after all version, a before each and an after each. When you set up your test, make sure that you set up relevant things in the relevant places. So certain instances of objects which are, let's just say, really heavy duty and do not and should not be instantiated multiple times in a class, set them up in the all version of your before and after methods. That way you're not taking up unnecessary resources for something that is much more test relevant, where you have to have fresh resources like a brand new browser using each version of the before and after methods instead. make sure you don't fall into the pitfall of opening up unnecessary amounts of information, or not opening up the required resources by being negligent and not setting up or starting or stopping services or functions or features in the relevant before, after, all and each methods. Number 10. Try to minimize the number of expecs you do per test. So let me explain why I would advise you reduce the number of expecs you have for a test. When an expect fails, you, well, expect something to not fail, as assuming that your code had worked. But if you go overboard and try and write variations of the same expect, or you try and expect things on different pages, if your test fails, without having to look at your test, you should have some confidence of knowing what the failure could be simply by reading the test. So let's just say in this case this test fails. We know we've got 4 different expect in this one test. Yes, the expect would probably tell us what the failure is. In this case, they're just numeric values. But let's say in complicated cases where we have different data for different fields, or different drop downs, or different radio buttons, or different checkbox, and so on. If an expect fails, all we'll get is something along the lines of your test failed. You'd need to dig into the test to find out exactly what it is that failed. But if you have a minimized number of expects per test, or your expects are testing effectively the same thing using different variations, then if your test fails, you know why it failed, or you at least have a better assumption of what the failure could be. It just saves time and makes your test a little bit more robust in delivering information if something goes wrong, without you having to go and explore the inner linings of your test individually. And that's it for this video, folks. If you enjoyed my top 10 video, then please subscribe and rate. If you have any questions or video suggestions, then please leave a comment below. Many thanks for watching. Until next time, ciao.